Hidden deep within the concrete walls of ADX Florence, America's most secure federal prison, are some of the most dangerous members of the Aryan Brotherhood. These men are more than inmates. They are architects of violence, masterminds of murder, and leaders of a white supremacist empire that spans coast to coast. Behind steel doors and under 23-hour lockdown, they continue to cast a long shadow over the federal prison system. From ruthless enforcers to silent commanders, these Aryan Brotherhood leaders built their legacy in blood, and even in isolation, their names still invoke fear and respect. This is their story behind the wire. Number 5. Clayton Fountain, the transformation of a supermax killer. In the cold, unforgiving world of maximum security prisons, few names are as haunting as Clayton Anthony Fountain. Once considered one of the most violent inmates in the federal prison system, Fountain's life story is a paradox of unimaginable brutality and spiritual transformation. A journey from bloodshed to redemption, all within the walls of a cell. Born in 1955 in the United States, Clayton Fountain came into the world under turbulent circumstances. His childhood was marked by abuse, neglect, and a lack of structure. By his teenage years, he had already run afoul of the law and found himself in and out of juvenile facilities. It didn't take long before his criminal behavior escalated into full-blown violence. At just 19 years old, Fountain was convicted of murder for killing a man during a robbery. He was sentenced to life in federal prison and quickly made his way through the ranks of violent inmates. Inside, he found protection, identity, and purpose in the Aryan Brotherhood, America's most feared white supremacist prison gang. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Fountain had become one of the Brotherhood's most feared enforcers. He was heavily built, intimidating, and completely unafraid of bloodshed. But it wasn't until 1983 that Clayton Fountain earned his infamy, a year that would forever change the U.S. federal prison system. On October 22, 1983, at the U.S. Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, Fountain murdered correctional officer Robert Hoffman. The attack occurred just hours after fellow inmate Thomas Silverstein murdered another officer, Merle Klutz. The two killings, carried out by separate Aryan Brotherhood members on the same day, sent shockwaves through the Bureau of Prisons. Fountain's assault was swift, brutal, and calculated. Using a homemade weapon, he stabbed Hoffman multiple times in a coordinated attack that demonstrated just how dangerous and organized the Brotherhood had become. In response, Marion went into a permanent lockdown. The incident helped lay the groundwork for the creation of ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, America's first supermax federal prison. After the murder, Clayton Fountain was placed under extreme isolation. No human contact, no privileges, and almost no hope of release into general population. But what happened next stunned even the most seasoned prison officials. In the silence of solitary confinement, Fountain underwent a profound transformation. Separated from the Aryan Brotherhood, he began reading extensively, philosophy, psychology, and eventually religious texts. Over time, he renounced his violent past, rejected white supremacist ideology, and converted to Catholicism. He began corresponding with religious mentors, including monks and priests, who helped guide him through a process of introspection and spiritual awakening. From the confines of his isolation cell, Fountain began writing essays, poems, and reflections on faith, redemption, and the human soul. He became a symbol of change, not because his past could be erased, but because he chose to confront it. His writings, later compiled and published, offered a rare glimpse into the mind of a man who had once lived by the blade, but now found purpose in prayer. Fountain's story attracted national attention. Some viewed his transformation as genuine, a testament to the power of faith even in the darkest corners of society. Others remained skeptical, seeing it as a calculated move by a seasoned manipulator. But even critics had to admit that his behavior had changed. No more assaults, no more defiance, just a man in a cell, writing, reading, and quietly atoning for the violence he once embraced. On July 12, 2004, Clayton Fountain died of a heart attack at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 49 years old. His death closed the final chapter of one of the most complex lives in American prison history. Clayton Fountain will forever be remembered as a paradox, a man capable of unspeakable violence, yet also capable of introspection and change. His life remains a haunting reflection of the extremes of human nature, how far one can fall and perhaps how far one can rise, even from the depths of a cell. Number 4. Thomas Silverstein, the most isolated man in America. In the history of the American prison system, no name is more synonymous with isolation, violence, and infamy than Thomas Edward Silverstein. A man once labeled by the Bureau of Prisons as the most dangerous inmate in America, Silverstein would spend more than 3 decades in solitary confinement, longer than any prisoner in U.S. history. Born in Long Beach, California, in 1952, Silverstein's early life was steeped in instability. Raised in a turbulent household, he found himself in trouble with the law at a young age. By his early 20s, Silverstein was already entangled in crime, earning convictions for armed robbery and drug offenses. In 1977, he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for armed robbery and sent to Leavenworth Penitentiary. It was the beginning of a descent into a world of extreme violence and isolation. Inside prison, Silverstein gravitated toward white supremacist ideology and eventually joined the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most feared prison gangs in the United States. Known for his calm demeanor and cold precision, Silverstein quickly proved himself to be more than just another gang member. He was a natural enforcer, ruthless, disciplined, and utterly loyal to the Brotherhood's code. In 1980, Silverstein was convicted of murdering fellow inmate Danny Atwell, who was accused of being an informant. Though that conviction was later overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct, it set the tone for what was to come. Between 1981 and 1983, Silverstein committed 3 more murders inside prison, each more brutal than the last. The most infamous came on October 22, 1983, at the U.S. Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. Silverstein, aided by other AB members, stabbed and killed corrections officer Merle Klutz. It was a meticulously planned ambush, and it marked one of the only times in U.S. history that a federal corrections officer was murdered by an inmate. Just hours later, another officer, Robert Hoffman, was killed by a separate inmate, prompting the Bureau of Prisons to lock down Marion entirely. It became the first federal supermax prison in America, and Silverstein was at the center of its transformation. In the wake of the murders, the Bureau of Prisons took unprecedented action. Silverstein was placed in what they called no human contact status. For over 35 years, he was confined to a small, windowless cell, 23 hours a day, with virtually no interaction with other humans. No visits, no phone calls, no physical contact. His isolation was so extreme, so total, that it sparked outrage from human rights organizations and legal scholars around the world. Despite his conditions, Silverstein maintained a high degree of mental focus. He spent years drawing, painting, and writing about his experience in solitary. In published letters and interviews, he insisted he had changed, that the man who committed those murders in the 1980s was not the same man he became in his later years. Still, the Bureau of Prisons showed no intention of easing his restrictions. Silverstein's supporters claimed he was a scapegoat, punished not just for his crimes, but for what he represented: the uncontrollable inmate, the symbol of prison system failure. His critics argued that his brutal history left the Bureau with no other option. On May 11, 2019, Thomas Silverstein died in a Florida hospital from complications due to heart surgery. He was 67 years old, At the time of his death, he had spent 36 years in solitary confinement, a record unmatched in American corrections history. To some, Silverstein was a monster, a cold-blooded killer who deserved every moment of his isolation. To others, he was a cautionary tale of a broken prison system, one that relied on extreme punishment over rehabilitation. Regardless of where one stands, his life story remains one of the most chilling and controversial in modern criminal justice history. Thomas Silverstein didn't just live in the shadows of the prison system, he helped reshape it. Through violence, he forced the government to rethink how it handled its most dangerous inmates. And through silence, he became the most isolated man in America. Number 3. Edgar Heava, the silent strategist of the Aryan Brotherhood. In the violent world of America's prison gangs, few names have remained as enigmatic and quietly powerful as Edgar Heava. A man who rarely spoke in public, but whose words behind prison walls carried the weight of death, Heava was a key architect of the Aryan Brotherhood's transformation into a highly organized and deadly criminal enterprise. Born in the 1940s in California, Edgar Wesley Heava's early life was typical of many who would later join the Brotherhood. He ran into trouble with the law as a young man and was eventually sentenced to prison during a time when racial violence and prison politics were intensifying across California's correctional system. It was inside those walls that Heava found his place. Drawn to the white supremacist ideology and structure of the Aryan Brotherhood, he rose through the ranks during the 1970s and 1980s. But unlike many AB members who earned their stripes through chaos and public violence, Heava was different. He was calculated, composed, and deadly quiet. An organizer, a thinker, and above all, a strategist. While the Brotherhood gained notoriety for prison yard stabbings and racially charged assaults, Heava operated behind the scenes. He wasn't always the one holding the shank, but he was often the one who ordered it drawn. As the Brotherhood grew, so did Heava's influence. He helped expand the gang's grip into new federal and state institutions, working with leaders like Barry the Baron Mills and Tyler T.D. Bingham to build a nationwide criminal network. By the late 1980s, the Aryan Brotherhood was no longer just a gang. It was a shadow government within the prison system. It trafficked drugs, ordered murders, and taxed inmates for protection and influence. In 1989, Heava's name came to national attention after he was linked to the murder of 2 inmates at the U.S. penitentiary in Lompoc. According to prosecutors, Heava had orchestrated the killings from behind bars using coded messages and trusted lieutenants. These were not spontaneous acts of violence. They were planned executions carried out with military-like precision. In 2002, the federal government launched one of the largest investigations into prison gang activity in U.S. history, targeting the Aryan Brotherhood under the RICO Act. Edgar Heava was indicted, along with other top leaders, on charges including racketeering, murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. The case was massive, spanning years of violence across multiple prisons and involving dozens of victims. During his trial, Heava maintained a calm, collected demeanor. He didn't testify. He didn't beg for leniency. He let the Brotherhood's code of silence speak for him. Prosecutors called him a mastermind, one of the men who turned the Aryan Brotherhood from a gang of street thugs into a prison mafia. Heava, they said, had the mind of a general, a man who moved chess pieces with lethal precision. He was convicted and sentenced to life in federal prison. Today, Edgar Heava remains locked inside the walls of ADX Florence, the nation's most secure federal penitentiary, where he is kept under near total isolation. Contact with the outside world is almost non-existent, and even communication within the prison is heavily monitored. But his influence, his legacy, still lingers among Brotherhood members and federal investigators alike. What makes Heava's story so chilling is not the brutality of his crimes, but the cold efficiency with which he committed them. He didn't act out of impulse or rage. He acted with intent, calculation, and the belief that the Aryan Brotherhood was not just a gang, but a way of life worth killing for. Edgar Heava was never the loudest man in the yard. He didn't need to be. He ruled through whispers, orders passed in code, and the fear that came from knowing a simple nod from him could mean a man's death. He remains one of the most quietly dangerous men to ever serve the Aryan Brotherhood, a reminder that in the dark corridors of America's prisons, the most powerful voices are often the ones you never hear. Number 2. Tyler Bingham, architect of the Aryan Brotherhood's empire. In the cold concrete corridors of America's most secure prisons, one name echoes with quiet authority: Tyler T.D. Bingham. Feared by inmates and closely watched by authorities, Bingham rose from obscurity to become one of the most powerful and dangerous leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood, the deadliest prison gang in U.S. history. Born in the mid-1940s, Tyler Davis Bingham's early life was marked by instability and petty crime. By the 1970s, he found himself deep within the California prison system, a young man hardened by time and surrounded by racial violence. It was behind bars that Bingham discovered his true calling, not as a common criminal, but as a general in a war for supremacy behind the walls. The Aryan Brotherhood, or AB, began in the 1960s in San Quentin State Prison as a white supremacist gang that offered protection in a violent, racially divided prison system. But under leaders like Bingham, the Brotherhood evolved into a highly structured criminal enterprise. It became less about race and more about power, control, and profit. And Bingham would be one of the men who turned the gang into a nationwide organization of fear and domination. By the 1980s and 1990s, Bingham had already established himself as one of the top shot callers in the federal prison system. Alongside fellow leader Barry the Baron Mills, Bingham ran the Brotherhood's federal faction like a military operation, giving orders, handling disputes, and enforcing discipline with violence. He was calculating, intelligent, and deadly. He didn't need to raise his voice. His word was law. One of Bingham's most infamous acts came in the early 2000s. From behind the bars of a supermax prison, he allegedly helped orchestrate a series of deadly attacks against rival gang members across multiple facilities. Messages were passed through coded letters, prison kites, and even legal mail, each one carrying orders for death. At least 2 inmates were murdered as a direct result of those orders. The federal government had seen enough. In 2006, Bingham, Mills, and other AB leaders were indicted in a sweeping RICO case. They were charged with conspiracy, murder, drug trafficking, and orchestrating violence from the confines of their cells. The courtroom was tense, the evidence massive. Prosecutors painted Bingham as the brain of a prison mafia, a man who built a criminal empire from solitary confinement. Even as he stood trial, Bingham remained defiant. He refused to cooperate, refused to betray the Brotherhood's code, and accepted his fate like a soldier at war. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But his punishment would be far more severe than most can imagine. Bingham was transferred to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence, also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. In this ultra-secure fortress, inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Contact with the outside world is almost non-existent. But even in isolation, Bingham's name carried weight. Other inmates feared him, and prison staff knew that with just one message, he could still cause chaos. Tyler Bingham's legacy is dark, violent, and deeply entwined with the blood-soaked history of American prison gangs. He didn't just follow the Aryan Brotherhood's path, he paved it. He helped transform it from a loose network of racist thugs into a powerful, well-organized syndicate that reached from death row cells to street-level crime syndicates across the country. But for all the power he held, his life ends in silence. locked away in a concrete box, surrounded by steel, and watched every minute of every day, Bingham remains a man feared more for what he's done than for what he might still do. His story is a chilling reminder of how the most dangerous criminal empires are often built not with guns or money, but with loyalty, fear, and absolute control from within the darkest corners of the prison system. Tyler T.D. Bingham, the man who turned a gang into an empire and who now lives in a cage of his own design. Number 1. Barry Byron, the Baron Mills, kingpin of the Aryan Brotherhood. In the savage underworld of America's prison system, few names evoke more fear and authority than Barry Byron, the Baron Mills. A founding leader of the Aryan Brotherhood's federal command structure, Mills was more than just a gang member. He was a warlord behind bars, orchestrating murder, trafficking, and racial warfare from the confines of his prison cell. Born in 1948, Barry Mills came from a middle-class background in Windsor, California. But despite his relatively stable upbringing, Mills gravitated toward violence and crime. In 1969, he was sentenced to prison for armed robbery, a conviction that would serve as the beginning of one of the most infamous careers in the history of American incarceration. Inside the California prison system, Mills quickly proved he was not like most inmates. He was cold, calculating, and brutally intelligent. It didn't take long for him to align with the Aryan Brotherhood, a small but rapidly growing white supremacist prison gang founded in San Quentin in the 1960s. By the late 1970s, Mills had earned his reputation through multiple assaults, including a violent attack where he reportedly cut out an inmate's eyes. It was the kind of violence that elevated him within the AB's brutal hierarchy. But Mills wasn't just a killer, he was a strategist. Alongside fellow leader Tyler T.D. Bingham, Mills transformed the Aryan Brotherhood from a loose group of prison toughs into a national criminal empire. From their prison cells, they established a sophisticated chain of command, running drug trafficking, extortion, gambling, and contract killings across multiple federal institutions. They communicated through coded letters, hidden notes known as kites, and contraband cell phones smuggled in through corrupt prison staff and visitors. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Mills helped orchestrate some of the most violent chapters in prison gang history. He approved murders of rival gang members, green-lighted assaults on suspected informants, and enforced the AB's iron-fisted rule in facilities from Marion to Florence. Nothing happened without his permission. He became the Brotherhood's de facto general, cold, unreachable, and feared. One of the most chilling operations attributed to Mills was a race war plot targeting members of the D.C. Black Prison Gang. Federal prosecutors alleged that Mills and Bingham authorized the murders of several black inmates across different federal prisons in a calculated campaign of racial retaliation. The operation left multiple inmates dead and placed Mills squarely in the crosshairs of federal investigators. In 2002, after years of surveillance, recordings, and informant testimony, the U.S. government brought down a historic RICO indictment against the Aryan Brotherhood's federal leadership. Barry Mills stood at the center of the case. Charged with ordering multiple murders, conspiracy, and running a criminal enterprise, Mills faced the full weight of federal prosecution. The case laid bare the Brotherhood's reach and the meticulous structure of the empire Mills helped build. Despite being confined in solitary for much of his life, Mills continued to exert influence. In 2006, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His new home, ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison in the United States, a place designed to house men too dangerous for general population. Mills was locked down 23 hours a day with limited contact to the outside world. But even then, the fear of his name lingered across the federal prison system. On July 8, 2018, Barry Byron Mills died in federal custody. His passing marked the end of an era for the Aryan Brotherhood. He was 70 years old. No dramatic shootouts, no final speeches, just a quiet death in a steel cage, far from the empire he helped command. Barry the Baron Mills remains one of the most significant figures in the history of prison gangs. He wasn't just a leader, he was a man who weaponized ideology, loyalty, and fear to build a legacy soaked in blood. His life serves as a grim reminder of how power, even behind bars, can rival that of any king on the outside.